Hi, I'm Ross Purnell, editor and publisher of Fly Fisherman magazine. Welcome to Loop, where we make deeper connections with the people behind the magazine. We're sponsored today by Patagonia. Patagonia has a great new line of waders out. They're called Swift Current waders. They have a traverse and expedition model. They've been reseamed and repatterned so that they're easier to repair. They're super comfortable, super durable, and the thing I really love is how they work with the stealth switch packs. They've got a system where you can clip the packs right onto the suspenders of the waders or onto the belt of the waders, and the waders just work really great with the packs, so check those out. We're also sponsored by G. Loomis, American-made fly rods made in Woodland, Washington. I've been using Loomis rods for probably 20 years. I got started on them from my friend Steve Rajeff, who is the best tournament caster of all time. Today I've got Asquith, NRX Plus, and IMX Pro rods in my quiver for different species, different situations, everything from saltwater to spey casting. So check those out. If you enjoy this podcast, you can support us by subscribing to Fly Fisherman magazine. You just go to flyfisherman.com. There's a button up in the top right-hand corner, and you can get the magazine delivered. You can also follow us on social media. On Instagram, we are at Fly Fisherman magazine. On Facebook, we're just at Fly Fisherman. And hopefully you are watching this podcast in its video form on our YouTube channel, which is at Fly Fisherman Magazine. Our guest today, we are very fortunate to have with us in the studio today, Captain Paul Dixon, who is a legendary fly fishing guide, who I have heard about and known for a couple of decades anyways. And he's also was very influential in the making of the new movie, Looking Through Water. We're grateful to have you here with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks, Ross. Appreciate all the kind words.
There's a lot of things we need to dive into today.
Okay.
Everything from California to New York to Florida, all across the country and all across the world. And we're probably going to hear some crazy, wild fishing stories.
I don't know about that, but maybe. Who knows?
There's a few.
Yeah.
But I want to start wherever you started fly fishing. Like, I'm curious to know how you started fly fishing.
Well, it's funny you say that. So I worked at a tennis and ski shop where I grew up in Southern California, Newport Beach. And the guy I worked for right when I was graduating from high school tells me that he's selling everything and that he bought a hunting and fishing camp in Idaho. And he was up on Henry's Lake. It was called the Wild Rose Ranch. And he said, "You want to come work for me since you're getting out of high school?" And I said, wow, my passion was, hunting and fishing. And I thought, that sounds great. I'll come up there for the summer. So I did. And when I got up there, the funny thing is a lot of the guys that were there were old timers, and they were, had their RVs or Airstreams in those days on the lake, and they spent the whole summer there. And half those guys were from the San Francisco Casting Club. So when I got up there, they turned around and they said, "Kid, we don't spin fish here, we fly fish." And so I spent a lot of time with these old timers that had spent decades up there on Henry's Lake, and they taught me to fly fish. And I just thought, this is the greatest thing, going. And the cool thing is that the lake was so prolific with really big cutthroat trout that it was like the bluefish blitzing. So it was a lot of action, and it wasn't, it was a lot of learning, but at the same time, you didn't have to be really good to, catch some really, quality trout. So it was cool.
I didn't know there was a connection with the Golden Gate Casting Club and Henry's Lake.
Yeah, for these old guys, Gil Drake and Ed Landry, and they were all involved with the casting club. And I think most of their their businesses were in, I'd say, mid-California. But, they were all big members, and that's what they sort of did. They'd travel around. They'd go up to San Francisco, go to the casting club, but they also, Southern California, they'd be down. And, I didn't, like I said, seeing them in Idaho was sort of, what's everybody doing here, So, but it was a fun time.
The same Gil Drake, the bonefish guy who?
No,
different.
It was a different guy.
Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, so that's sort of how I got into it, and I spent, I think, 4 months. At the end of the time, I ended up guiding up there, probably because I was really just the boat boy, would get everybody ready in the morning, but I was fishing every day that I could and days off. And so, and the Madison was close. West Yellowstone was only 17 miles away. It was sort of the beginning of Henry's Fork, was Henry's Lake runoff. And so it just, it was like nirvana, because and in those days, the fishing was awesome. And there wasn't a ton of people, so it was fun.
Talk about nirvana right after high school, and all of a sudden you're right in the center of everything.
Yeah, it was cool. And then, when I got back to Southern California, I was trying to decide which colleges and this and that. And Southern California, where I grew up, didn't have, the trout fishing. I could drive up to Mammoth, or I could drive up to, Northern California, but I just liked it so much that I started in saltwater in the back bay of Newport Beach. There was a big estuary back there in those days, and still is, but it's all built up around it. But so we just, spent a lot of time tossing the fly rod around there and practicing. And then I ended up spending a lot of time in Baja, trying to, go after Pacific barracuda and, whatever swim, really,
What do you catch in the estuary at Newport Beach?
Weirdly enough,
Stripers?
there were stripers in there. Yeah, they
Wow.
in those days they had stocked the striper. They brought them out from the East Coast, and in the turn of the century, they dumped stripers all over California. So the estuary back there in those days was one of the few spots that they still had some stripers in. The Delta up in Sacramento has a ton of stripers. Now they're trying to get rid of them, but that's where I caught my first stripers, was back in Newport Bay.
That's crazy to me. I didn't know that. Like, the best known striper guide of all time, you actually caught them out in California, where they're kind of an invasive species or whatever. Like,
well,
they're not
trying
native.
to get. It's weird because, like I said, they're trying to get rid of them. And if you look at the world's records on striped bass, they're two of the world's records, I think, are out of Oregon. And like 12, and they're 50-pound fish, and they're still there. There's still fish
In the Sacramento River system, there's just mega fish.
Yeah. So it was sort of interesting that, and I've talked to friends since, and some guys are fishing in the Delta, but a lot of guys are doing the surf casting on the beaches, and they're catching stripers. If you know where to go, they're actually, out in front, and, Santa Cruz, and, I don't know exactly where it is, but I hear these reports of friends that, say, hey, we can go right on the beach and get them now.
California beach fishing is tricky business, but the guys who know it. Did you ever fish for Corvina when you lived there?
I did, and I've got some dear friends, now that do it a lot. I didn't know that much about it. I'd see them all the time, but usually if I was down at the beach where they were, I was surfing, but I'd see them, a lot. But I've got, Nick Curcione is a good friend of mine, and he fishes, and Al Catroci is out there. He's written books on Corvina fishing, and it's a cool fish, and they're tough.
I've never caught one, but it sounds fascinating. And, I've looked at the videos and photos. I'm like, wow, that looks very difficult.
Yeah. Well, it's, it's the thing. Anything that you can sight fish is a cool fish, in my opinion. So whether it's a carp, a corvina, but that's the thing. You've got these little fish that come in, and they're eating mole crabs, and we used to see them surfing. You'd see, what is that thing, and it'd swim up, and then it'd go back with the swell, and it was cool. But now it's become a big thing.
Yeah, they're right in the wash.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So how did a West Coast guy end up on the East Coast?
That's a funny question. So I got invited, weirdly enough, to a fundraiser in London. And so the fundraiser was for Prince Charles and Diana. It was their fundraiser. And the bank that I did business with said, oh, you should come to this. I was single. I was 30 years old. And they said, you should come to this. It's really cool. And the idea was, if Prince Charles was trying to put Palestinian and Jewish kids in the same school together. And so to build rapport with each other, understand each other's issues. So that. I'm not sure how well that worked, but needless to say, I went to this thing, and one of the guys was the head of immigration for Kennedy, but at the time he worked for a guy named Albert Broccoli, and Cubby Broccoli produced all the James Bond films. And so he asked me if I'd like to go to the premiere of Octopussy. And I told him, I said, wow, that sounds cool. And he said, under one condition, though, you got to take this girl that's over here going to London School of Economics. So I said, well, okay. I was wondering, what is she, 400 pounds? But anyway, so we did, and I met her and everything. And to make it short, we sort of fell in love, and she came back, and I visited her place in New York, and her family had a place out in the East End of Long Island in Southampton. And so, got out there, and this is like the birthplace of the striper. And there was a duck blind sitting out right in the backyard. So I thought, wow, this is really cool. It was sort of like Newport in the very early days. It hadn't been developed. It hasn't been. And so I just thought, wow, this is so cool. So I loved the area. She came and got her master's in California at USC. And then we decided to move back. And so when I got out of my company, she wanted to come back and work for her dad. And so I wanted to get into fly fishing, because that was my passion. By then, I was deeply into it. So and I just couldn't believe that, you could still fish from the beaches and everything in New York. And so when I came out and saw it, we ended up moving back out there. And I thought, okay, how can I get into the business? And so I actually went and applied at Orvis in New York City. We had a place in New York. We were originally in Connecticut, and so I'd go back and forth on the train, and I'd see Orvis when I get off the train. I couldn't believe they had a fly shop in New York City. So I started hanging out there, and one day I walked in and said, do you need any part-time help? Because I wanted to figure out a way that I could get into the industry. And I figured, well, this is a way. I was thinking of opening a lodge, and I was thinking of all these different things that I might be able to do my, fly fishing, my passion. By then, I was addicted. So anyway, so they said, yeah. So I ended up working on the 45th and I think Madison Orvis store originally, and it was right at the train station, in Grand Central. So where you'd walk out, it was right next door. So I did that. I could fly fish in the morning for trout on in Connecticut where I was living at the time, and then I'd go to Orvis. In the evening, I'd come back and I'd go striper fishing on the beaches, So, it worked out pretty well. And Orvis is the one that actually said, you want to open a store, you're always out in the East End of Long Island, why don't you do something out there? And so I started thinking, okay, well, maybe we can do this, So, excuse me. And, by this time, the the fly fishing boom was really going off. The river runs through it, just had come out, and the saltwater fly fishing was really coming, and fortuitously the striped bass, which had been decimated, through the 80s, was basically, they had a moratorium, and by the early 90s, it was really coming back strong. And so by the time that I found a store out the east end of Long Island and opened it up, the striper was almost recovered. It was deemed recovered in 1995. And I opened the store, I think, in late 93, 94. And so, it's all of a sudden the fisheries recovered and it was booming. And I had started teaching schools for Orvis on saltwater fly fishing pretty early on. Randy Carlson and myself started a school. So we'd, do a 2-day school and it was booming. We'd fill every class because after the river runs through it, everybody wanted to learn to fly fish. And that was one of the pivotal movies,
Mm-hmm. Good timing with the movie, and the striped bass population goes up and down, but that was the big peak.
Yeah, it was just like I said, I just got really lucky, I bought boats, and we just started going out and exploring and, seeing what was there. And we started seeing, fish on the flats and the striper. By that time, they were everywhere, so, you could walk out of any beach pretty much had stripers on them, so, and then the people, we started doing the classes, and I'd take, 10 people would take the class for 2 days, and 5 of them would come back and buy an outfit, and they became your customers,
So your saltwater school, it must have been striped bass specific and right off the beach.
Right. We used to, Randy Carlson, who was the manager at Orvis, and myself started it. And we used to go out to Sherwood Island State Park out in Connecticut at first, Mm-hmm. And then, it was about the same time that at the fly fishing show opened, in Edison, in New Jersey. And so it all coincided with, just sort of everything, fell into place. I don't know.
Growth period.
Yeah. So.
And there you were, right at the center of the storm.
Yeah, it was just, fortuitous, and it was lucky. The striper was really the thing that's recovery. Was the greatest success story in conservation in this country, I think, mm-hmm. because it was gone. It was oblivion, so, and it was amazing to see where, how many came back. Like I said, almost every beach, had stripers on it.
Where are we at now in terms of the up and down cycles of striped bass?
It's not good. It's unfortunately, we've been fighting these battles for a long time, but, right after that happened, the size limit was 36 inches. And then all of a sudden they say, hey, there's so many fish, we're going to lower the size. And that's when I started going to hearings and saying, why don't you err on the side of caution? Why don't you just keep it where it is and let them breed for another season and make sure that everything's, there's so many fish. So they didn't. They lowered the size to 28 inches. And then a few years later, they decided that let's go 2 fish, and we went back to the hearings again and said, why do you do that? But the way that the whole thing is set up with the committee that sort of runs this, they basically, each state gets a representative. And some of the states want to kill them. Some states are all commercial. Some of them are, it's a game fish. And so to get consensus on things and to, and the problem that I see is when you base your whole business, whether it's commercial, on killing fish, it doesn't bode well for the fish. And I never thought I'd see the disappearance of the blitzes in Montauk. And, 6, 7 years ago, all of a sudden there's no blitzes. Then it was sort of indicative that, in all the models that they do in for the DEC and everything, it's like if everything goes well, we can take X amount of tons and we can do this and it's great. But the one thing you don't count on is that the spawning is terrible because the conditions in the rivers and the stuff in the Chesapeake and because of pollution and survival. Every year for 60 years, they've taken a what they call a Young of the Year index, and they count the fish that are coming out of the rivers that survive. And way back in the 80s, it was flatline. And then when they started the recovery, by the time in 96, 97, 98, you have these huge years of spawning success. And that's where these fish, all these big fish now that we have, you come to find out that, everybody thinks, oh, the striper, it lives, 5, 10 years, whatever. Well, they're 25, 30-year-old fish. And so then what happened is the spawning fell off, and whether that's lack of fresh water, you need the salinity levels or whatever, to make it right. So all of a sudden you don't have conditions. The spawning for 7 years straight goes bad, and it's just sort of flatlined again. So now you've taken out all the fish that are the 28 inches and above, and they stacked them like cordwood for years, And so you're killing the really big fish that are the spawners. The spawning's bad, and now we're in trouble again. It's sad to see what's happened. There's a lot of fish of different year classes, but you don't have the year classes in between. You've got a group of really big fish, and then there's a couple of year classes right now. The 2015, that was a good year class comparatively, that we had better spawning, but they're all coming into the slot limit. And so the minute they get, and that's why the regulations changed last year so rapidly, they realized you can't have the 1 year class coming into the slot limit and have it in that slot limit for 5 years without killing off the whole year class. So that's why they went from, it was, I think, 28 inches to 35. And literally within a month, they said, wait, mistake. It's 28 to 31. So that they could, get those fish out of that year class so that they didn't kill all of them.
Yeah, if you only have 1 year, 2015, man, that's 10 years ago.
That's the
it's
problem.
been 10 years since you had a good spawn. You can't have regulations that allow or encourage harvest of that specific year class.
Well, it's so political. It's unfortunate because we all want more fish in the water, but you can't, base your whole outcome on killing fish and expect that it's gonna be A-okay, especially when you say the spawning's bad. So, it's been a battle, but there's some great people trying to battle it and trying to, work things out. And I think everybody wants the same thing, which is more fish, but the commercial fishery gets a huge, chunk of it, and they get to keep larger fish, which are the more prolific spawners. So, it's always these back and forth battles with,
Who are the good organizations and good people fighting the fight on this front?
Well, I think that there's a new one. It's called the American Saltwater Guides Association. And the reason that they called it that is because they needed a user group to represent that these people are actually making their, everybody can join it. Everybody can find out about what's really happening. But that's one of the better ones. There's, a lot of organizations, Coastal Conservation dabbled in it in New York for a while. I don't think their presence or for redfish and stuff is in different areas, but there's individuals, that the Patroon Group and they're all fighting for the whole thing. We've done a lot of work with a lot of small little groups that are trying to, whether it's fly clubs, whether it's this, and people that go to the hearings and try to give their input. But the American Saltwater Guides Association, it's not just guides, it's people that want more fish in the water.
Yeah,
and so
and they're to save a fish, you just can't appeal to the fish itself. If you're talking to politicians, you have to have like a monetary value to it, and businesses need to speak up for it. That's why guides have a powerful voice, because they can show that the striped bass have value.
Right. And the same thing in Florida is, Captains for Clean Water. You finally get a group that says enough. We've got to start, thinking about some of these issues. The organization that I joined years ago that I really learned a lot from, and was sort of the basis, was the Bonefish Tarpon Trust. Because I joined it very early on when it just started, and it was, let's get the science, to have the data to give the, work with the politicians, legislation, and everything else to get things done. And so that's why the Guides Association is trying to, but that seems to be the business model. We need to find the facts and get the data so that we can, understand the fish, the habitat, and everything much better. So
the science needs to come first.
That's right. So that's and those are one of the organizations and that is sort of working with everybody now, because they do have some data. And weirdly enough, there's stripers in Florida, and there's areas in the Chesapeake that they worked with. They were, all sorts of different collaborations that make sense. But, that was an early organization that really had the idea that, let's get some science and find out the facts. And
yeah, I've learned a lot from ASGA, just the research that they're doing. Like, I thought all of the stripers were one big population, but our stripers all come from the Chesapeake, basically. And all those striped bass up in Canada is a totally different population. Different. Yeah. I thought they mixed or something, but
no.
I was wrong.
I was on the board of Atlantic Salmon Federation years ago, and they started talking about it, the stripers up here. And I thought, oh, what? They're coming all the way up here? But it's not. Once again, the data shows you that they were, one of the first organizations to, find out where the fish are going and what the salmon were doing and everything else. And you find out that that the striper up there was native to that whole bay and area where they're found, but they also fished them out,
Yeah, they were all gone.
And then they put a moratorium, and now they're back in force. And there's a lot of controversy because, some people think that they're eating all the salmon, which there's no doubt that the predation on the salmon is smolts and stuff is probably not good. But now they're starting a fishery up there. There's a lot of guides that are coming out and doing the stripers in Canada, but it's not the same fish.
Yeah, the Atlantic salmon guys up there are not fans of the stripers.
No, that's it. They asked myself and C.D. Clark years ago if we'd bring my skiff up there and sort of look around and see, and it was one of the lodges on the Miramichi. And I think that they could see the handwriting on the wall. Their salmon fishery was going down, but they'd send me film and say, "Look at this," of the stripers and everything that was going on in the river. And if it wasn't in the middle of my season, I probably would have gone up there and did it, because it was just, they were everywhere.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting conflict, because the stripers and the salmon, they coexisted up there for 10,000 years, so they should get along. But when it gets out of balance like that, there's a lot of stripers, and there's, the salmon are barely hanging on for a whole bunch of other reasons in the first place. It's sort of like kicking someone when they're down.
Yeah, well, that's it, and it's usually us humans that take things out of balance. So, such is life.
So you do most of your guiding in Montauk around Long Island area, which is a cool area, but seems like you're guiding all over the place. You guide in Florida?
Yes. Well, as you find out as you become, you know, um, what happens is in guiding, as I tell a lot of, the young guides are up and, whatever, is that, it all comes down to the number of days that you guide. That determines how much money you're going to make, how much do you make a day, and how many days you're going to do it. And that's, it's pretty easy to figure out. If you're making a $500 or $1,000 a day and you're working 100 days, you're $100,000. Take out your expenses, the bang, and there's your, So early on, I started guiding around, Montauk and doing that. And then I, hired more guides and, so the business sort of developed, but still, it's about the number of days. And so, one day I was actually filming the Walker's Cay Chronicles, and I get this phone call, and it's from this guy down at the Ocean Reef Club. And so, he says, "Hey, would you consider coming down here?" And they'd heard from Orvis because being in New York City, one of the things the greatest thing I think I ever did to get into the industry was working for Orvis, and especially Orvis, New York. And the reason being is that anybody that fly fished in New York eventually came into Orvis, so I got to know them. So my clientele was all these young guys that, like myself, were starting in their business. So we all started fly fishing. There was this big passion about it and everything else. And so at the Ocean Reef Club, there was a guy that was going to start a new store there, for Orvis. And I think Orvis told him, you should talk to this guy because he has a clientele that's, very similar, And so he calls me. And his name was Bruce Miller, and he says, "Would you consider, coming down here with your people?" And I knew about the Ocean Reef. I'd actually been down there in the 70s, And it's a cool spot because it sits right on the edge of Biscayne National Park, literally, at the end of the tip of Key Largo. And it was originally started as a fishing, camp. So anyway, so I said, "Well, I'll come talk to you," but I hung up the phone and Flip was there. And so I said, "Flip, do you ever hear of this guy, Bruce Miller?" And he says, "Yeah." I said, what do you think about him?" And he thought for a second, as Flip would, and he says, "Nobody knows it better." And that's all he said. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool, So anyway, I went down and talked to him and decided, okay, this is, because out where I live in the East End of Long Island, in those days, you made it in the summer, but you gave it all back in the winter. So it was tough. That's why the fly fishing show, when it started, in the early 90s, I knew from working at Orvis that I could take my whole shop there, and Orvis made that possible. In the early days, they bought the booths. So they came in, nobody would sign up. So Randy Carlson, who was running the Orvis, originally we did it as corporate stores for the fly fishing show. And then Randy turned around and said, "We're going to make it, the dealers." Well, none of the dealers would sign up. So Randy calls me one day and says, "I've got 4 booths at the fly fishing show. Do you want them?" And I said, "Sure," because I knew from working at Orvis that, we'd go there for the weekend and make $30,000-$40,000. And for me with the store, that was like enough to get maybe through the winter. So when they offered it, I went, sure, I'll do the fly fishing show in New Jersey, packed up the whole store and took it. So wow. That's how, sort of surviving in the business. Otherwise, we probably would have died, but the guiding was the other thing, why that, when Bruce called, I thought, okay, here's how I can get more days on the water, because that was really the cash flow, So I went down there, talked to him, and we started going down there.
Fishing for permit, bonefish, tarpon?
all of them, whatever I
all
could
up
find.
into the Everglades and in Biscayne?
No,
Or?
because in the early days, I kept the boat at the Ocean Reef Club. There was 5 guides that were allowed at the dock, called the mosquito fleet, or the small boats, and I was one of them. And so he opened a store there. It was an Orvis store, and there was 5 guides, and so that was one of the things. And sort of a funny story, but I was fishing with a guy over at Walker's Cay. My buddy John, his family had Walker's Cay, and he was he was a guide out of Isla Mirada, and I forget his name, Bob, whatever. But he was helping Walker's Cay with their guide program, and so I told him, I said, I've been asked to guide down at the at the Ocean Reef Club, and he's like, "You've been asked to guide in the Keys?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "They're going to hate you. They're going to hate you, man. Are you serious? They'll hate you." And I said, "Well, I know it's a little tough, the Isla Mirada gang and everything else." And he said, "So who invited you down?" I said, "A guy named Bruce Miller." He said, "So how are you supposed to learn it?" I said, "Well, Bruce Miller said, I'm going to show you around and show you the stuff." He said, "So Bruce Miller's going to take you around and show you the stuff?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Could I go?" And he did, He's like, "I want to go with Bruce Miller and learn."
He did go.
Yeah, he did go, So he came with us. So like Flip said, nobody knows it better. And this guy knew that, he was. But in those days, the guides that I really looked up to was, of course, Flip. He wasn't at that point guiding much anymore. But, Bob Branham and Mark Croca and these guys that were really the kings of that area, So
I had a chance to fish with Bob in Biscayne Bay,
yeah,
probably 10 years ago. What a guy.
yeah,
He's super cool.
Yeah.
We should, both of us just found out yesterday that Flip passed away.
Yeah.
I know he was very close with you.
Well, I've known him since '96 when we shot the show and everything. And, that's one of the, what I feel really fortunate about is actually the people that I've met in the industry. And I've been, I look back now and said, how did this all happen, But, John's family, John Applenap's family, owned Walker's Cay. And I got to know John very early. And John was instrumental in, getting Flip on board with the Chronicles, which was the big show. So when we decided to, shoot something up in Montauk, they'd never been out of Florida, and John's dad had said, "Well, maybe you could help us. You got any ideas?" And I said, "Yeah, you need to get out of Florida and get to where the growth is going right now in fly fishing's in the Northeast because the striper." And John knew that. He was, on the flats with us, we became close friends, and every day we'd talk about what was going on. And so, the next thing is that Flip and I called Bob Popovics. I said, "Okay, we could do 2 shows and you get it for the price of 1." So Bobby was a really good friend, and Bobby was one of the first guys that came out to the flats and saw it with me, and the first guy ever that I knew that would carry a camera, a big old time on the back. Bobby wanted to document stuff, so Bobby came out and, we shot 2 shows, one on the boat and one with Bobby on the beach. Unfortunately, when Flip arrived, there was a hurricane that came with him, But the first day he was there, I'll never forget it. I said to John's first mate, Jack, I said, "Drive him around, call me when you get in, and drive him on the beach, and I'll tell you where the fish are." Because the fish were in, there was big blitzes. And when I first talked to Flip, he's like, Paul, how reliable is this really? If we come, I said, Flip, if you come up within these 2 weeks, I think that you'll be blown away what it's like. He's like, all right. So he came up, and Jack brings him down to the beach, and we're right in front of this area that we call Oyster Pond, and it's black with bass. It just, if you didn't know it, they weren't foaming at that time, but you could see the black of these huge schools or whatever. So Flip gets out of the car, and I'll never forget, he's sitting there with his orange boots on, and he walks down, and we're yelling at each other back and forth. And Paul, what's that? He said, hey, Flip, what are you doing? Welcome. And he's like, what's going on? And I kept pointing down, and he's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, look down. And it was, Flip, look at your feet. And he looks down, and then he realizes, what's going on. And he's like, and he literally walks down with his orange boots, and he starts sort of nudging these fish that are in the wash. He's like, oh my God. So we meet back after I take the boat. We meet back at this place called the Lake Club, and I think he pulls out his favorite rub. He sits down and says, oh my God, this is insane. And he calls John Donnell, Dozer. And he says, Dozer, you got to get up here, man. You got to see this, So he was thrilled. But the next day, a hurricane came, so it just blew out everything. And, Bobby was devastated because they allowed 4 days each shoot, So the first 4 days was the shore show. So it was really cool. We did a lot of B-roll and drove around, and and all the surf casters in those days, it was just crawling with surf casters. So there was a lot of interaction, a lot of fun stuff. I forget who Percy, I forget his name, but he was a big jazz musician. And Chico Fernandez was a big jazz, and Flip's like, oh my God, I'm going to get Percy, Percy Heath, I think it was, to sign this, for Chico, So, but it was a great time. And, Flip, he was an icon. I couldn't believe that I was, shooting the Chronicles with Flip Pallot, because that was, one of the things that I'd watch the Chronicles every, weekend or whatever. So
it's a seminal moment in fly fishing. Like when you think about it, you and Bob Popovics and Flip Pallot together on the beach, and now those two greats have passed away. But that's got to be one of the great moments in fly fishing.
It is, and it's
history.
you see that we're all getting older, So and it's just it's unfortunate with both of them, It's. I just feel lucky. It's the same thing with Lefty. I never in my wildest dreams thought that I'd spend, literally 5 years in a row fishing with Lefty, but it was, I'd see him at the fly fishing shows, and I'd admire him from afar, but I never, I was too bashful to go up and say, hi, Lefty, or whatever. And then John Applenapp calls me one day, and he said, we should show this to Lefty, we should get Lefty out there. And so I turned around and said, well, Lefty. I don't know him. He goes, yeah, but his friends. So maybe if we invite his friends, I'll call Lefty. And then, let's call, Bob Popovics and Nick Curcione and a few others. And then we'll tell Lefty all his friends are coming too. So, and it was funny because, Lefty calls John back and says, John, I think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to come out. And he says, well, Lefty, if you don't mind, we invited a few of your friends. And Lefty, and why do I need them guys? but it turned into we called it the Pirates Party Flats Extravaganza. But it just turned into, once they saw it, and once Lefty saw the flats, he was blown away. And Bobby had filmed a little bit before Lefty got there, that we had flats footage of he and our buddy Lance, and so when Lefty came, Ed Jaworowski and Jeffrey Cardenas and John Cole, who wrote the book of the Tarpon, Peter Matheson, Jimmy Buffett, it just turned into this every year it got more and more, because when people saw it, it was like, oh my God, this is insane, and it was great. So I just, like I said, I just feels, I never thought in my wildest dreams that I'd be, fishing with Lefty Kreh or with Flip Pallot or, all these guys. And so to see, people that sort of made your dreams come through, all of a sudden start dropping by the wayside, it's sobering,
It's a big loss for fly fishing community.
Yeah, it's and I don't know, it makes my heart cry. I don't want to start right now, but they turned into dear friends, very special people that really believed in sharing and the sharing of the sport. And that's what it's all about. And when it comes down to it, you come to realize in your older age and everything that it really wasn't about the fish. The fish was the excuse. It was about the people. And it was the camaraderie that we all had, the time together and the fun and the laughter. And, the fish brought you to these beautiful places and everything. But in the end analysis, it was really the people.
And they were great teachers, and great mentors.
I mean, we used to sit at the flats. If we got blown out out in Montauk or whatever, I mean, Ed Jaworowski would be up with his whiteboard explaining casting, and we'd all be sitting around, and Bob Popovics is tying his flies, and Lefty's out there casting, and it was just this fantastic time,
That is amazing.
Yeah, it was unreal, and all these people that, were big book writers and, famous artists and, musicians. I mean, just everything. They just gathered because the fishing brought them together, and that was the cool thing.
Yeah, and you're all instantly friends because you have that in common. It's about the fish and the activity.
And that's the great thing about the sport, It's how you all come together and the sharing of ideas. That's why, it's so funny now. I look at, I think it was down at maybe the Swamp Guides Ball or something. And so, you look at all these guys that are, and the Swamp Guides Ball is not only really good, guides that are fishing that, but it's like a combination of great anglers, great guides and everything else. And so my friend was fishing it, I think 2 years ago or whatever. I turned around and called him and said, "So Dave, how'd Swamp Guides Ball go?" And he turns around and he says, "Well, we didn't do very well. Everybody got smoked." I said, "Really? Who won?" He said, "These two 12-year-old kids, and it was cool. It was like, you're kidding me." He said, "No, because, there's some really young kids now, that are, they take their skiffs to school. And they're just passionate, and they've gone off and learned all new stuff. It's not like, oh, I learned this spot from so-and-so, or, oh, I heard that, they just went out and fished. And he said it was unreal. And when you hear the people that were in the tournament, big tournament guys, big guides and everything. And when he said, we all got smoked, man.
That's hilarious.
And I love that stuff, seeing young kids and,
Kids are doing something a little different. Like everyone else is doing the tried and true stuff. So you can expect the kids to just pull a wild card and go somewhere where no one else goes.
Yeah, well,
that's cool.
I don't know. I just, and the technology, a lot of the stuff that has changed so much is, I've got friends that are now, drone footage and the stuff that Bobby was carrying, this huge camera and would lug it around, and the editing and everything else. And now you see some of the content coming out of the fishing industry. It's cool. And some guys have really they can bring you, right to your living room, the excitement of the fishing.
Popovics was like the first guy to film a lot of this stuff, like stripers up busting on the beach and feeding on sand eels and stuff. And he didn't have the ease of an iPhone that you could just dip in the water and have in your pocket all the time.
And that was the cool thing.
His van was like a whole like almost a movie studio on the beach.
Yeah, it was great. And you know, one of the funny thing is when we first shot the blitzes in Montauk, I told him, I said, Bobby, you got to come out. You got to see us. What do you got going on? I said, the bass blitzes are insane. So he came out and he filmed all this stuff, and afterwards he gave me the film, and it was like the first year of my shop doing the Edison fly fishing show. So we went and got a little black and white TV with a big old DVR or whatever it is, plug it in, the old tape and everything, and we played that thing. And the aisles got so crowded that the fire marshal came and said, you got to shut that thing off, because people couldn't
I remember
believe
that,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, and so they're like, you got to turn that thing off. And people are like, where is that? What are those? So it was cool. And Bobby, it was all him. He edited the things, he put it together, he put music, he'd drive the beaches in New Jersey, and I saw a bluefish blitz and some really cool stuff, little kids catching, but Bobby was the documenter.
Common stuff today, but back then it was a very difficult thing to do, and he was
right.
really the only one doing it.
Wow, it was cool.
He was doing it. So Walker's Cake Chronicles was your first experience in like doing a production or a TV show, but you've been on a bunch of them over the years.
Yeah, the Jose came up and filmed a show, and that was fun. Fishing wasn't that great, but Jamie Howard was running the coast. It's just, I've been, like I said, fortunate, but I think a lot of it has to do with the striper anyway. Montauk was known as a world-class destination. I just happened to be there, and the striper was just happened to be coming back. So it was, I've got a couple of shows that are coming up, where other guys are like, we want to come up and do this, because if the fishery's there, it's a great location, and it's pretty predictable, So if you're looking for footage and stuff, so I've just been fortunate that once again, just people like, hey, we'd like to come up and do something up there, and luckily that was because we had a fishery and the striper had recovered. Otherwise, they wouldn't have come in the old days in the '80s because there was nothing, So. But we've done a lot of shows with different people.
A lot of great experience with production, which is probably part of the reason you got involved in the film Looking Through Water, or there's a lot of reasons, I guess.
Yeah. No,
and I wanted to talk about Looking Through Water, but I guess we should start with your relationship with Bob.
So it's funny because Bob Rich and myself go way back, and it was another one of those, just unbelievable, like, okay, and one day I get a call at the Ocean Reef Club that, would you come down to Chica Lodge, and Bob Rich would like you to, teach casting some of the people. And so I thought, okay. And I'd heard of Bob, through his, a couple of books and stuff, but I'd heard locally, that he was part of the Redbone tournament and everything else. And so I said, all right, I'll go to Chica Lodge and do it. So when I got there, it was for one of Bob's company, outings or their, symposium for the company, whatever it may be. So anyways, so they take me right up to meet Bob, and right away it's a joke, he's like, oh my God, and we had a mutual friend, and he turned around, can you believe it was a girl that I was dating, and so, it was like, okay. And then afterwards, it was all over, and I wanted to say goodbye and everything, thank you. And he said, what are you doing tomorrow? And so he said, come to the Isla Mirada Fishing Company for the fishing club for, lunch. We're all so I went over there, and I ended up fishing with his son Barney the next day. I got canceled, and Barney said, oh, I can't forget it. I said, why don't you just come with me and we'll go? And then Bob and I started a relationship, and it was all about fishing. It was the mutual love of fishing. And so we started fishing the Redbone tournaments, which were, for the benefit cystic fibrosis. It was started by our mutual friend, Gary Ellis and Susan Ellis. And it was a great cause because it was to catch the cure for cystic fibrosis. And Gary had found out that his daughter, Nicole, had cystic fibrosis. And so he started this tournament, and Bob and Ted Williams and President Bush Sr., and they all stepped up. And so when they decided they wanted to maybe do something outside of Florida and the Florida Keys, and so I was approached about doing something in Montauk. And I said, okay. So we knew that we could put together a pretty good crowd because, I knew everybody sort of in the financial end of things, that fly fished. And so everybody, when they heard about it, they all, stepped up, and they said, oh, we'll do it, So it turned, the first time we did it in Montauk ended up being the biggest and the most money they'd ever raised for the
Redbone.
For Redbone. And so there was a lot of people dedicated, and plus the numbers. When you got the Florida Keys guides and everything that came out, and I remember Rusty Auberry and Craig Brewer and everything. They came up, and I knew we were going to get blown out the next day, but the blitzes were going on. So I turned around and I said, Gary, let me take Craig and them out real quick, and show them what's going on. Well, when they went out there and saw it, they were blown away, So we started the tournament doing it, and Bob was, he's part of the thing, and he says, well, I'll come, but I want to fish with you. And I said, great, I got Tim Borski, and he knows Tim, and Tim's, great, not only great fisherman, fly tire artist and everything, but probably one of the funniest men on the planet, So we formed a team, and we started doing the Redbone in Montauk. And so it just took off. So, Bob and I go way back. We started at BTT. He was one of the founding members. And I think it was probably 14, 15 years ago, BTT came to me and said, can we do something in New York? And I was actually sitting with Bob. This was a symposium down in, I think, Dania Beach and at the IGFA. And I was sitting with Bob, and I go back to the table after, I think it was Russ Fisher and Tom Davidson had come up to me, who was the president chair, and said, can we do something in New York? And I turned around and I, looked at Bob. I said, they want me to do something in New York. I'm like, oh boy, how am I going to do this? And he's like, well, I'll be there if you need me for anything. I'll help you, And it was like, okay, there's a little incentive, And so I figured if I could go back and get the talent, that it would work. And so I went back and I called Tom Brokaw and I called Lefty Kreh. And I knew they were buddies, and I'd known Tom for eons working at Orvis. He would always come in and we'd chit-chat. And I think I was the only one in New York or whatever that he could talk fishing with when he was out in Montana and trout fishing. So they said, yeah, we could do something. So then I called Andy Mill and said, hey, Andy, do you think you could MC this dinner that we could maybe throw it, And then I called all my friends that in New York, the guys that were really involved, John Fisher from, the shop there and the Anglers Club, Rick Bennett, all these guys that all stepped up and said, yeah, we'll do something. And so we started the New York dinner. And last year, that dinner raised, $1.5 million, 25% of BTT's budget. So
it's their biggest fundraising event of the year every year now.
And Bob was instrumental in that, in the early days, I'd say, okay, let's see who we could get, and he'd say, okay, let's get this. And then he'd MC it. when Sandy Moret and who else? Steve Huff and Borski and I wanted to make it fun. We both did, and that's the thing I love about Bob is he's all about the fun. So it's like I don't want to just have one honoree and it's sort of a boring night. Let's have a little interaction and that's what Bob loved to do. So it's like So it turned into a fun event, and now it's everybody loves it because it's not only like Old Home Week, and you're honoring great people, but usually the people were trying to get an entertainment venue that, it's a lot of, it's fun. It's not just, come here and we'll, be a boring event.
It's fun, but it's for a good cause too.
That's the
it's
thing.
really making a difference. BTT is really making a difference in the science and preserving the fish.
Yeah, and how they legislate now. They've got the ear of a lot of different Caribbean governments. They're working with these islands and the stuff they found out. It's why the bonefish are coming back in the Keys right now, because they finally figured out that a lot of that stuff is coming in from Cuban and the currents and everything else. So they went to Cuba, and the interesting thing, like in Cuba, was that all the guys that were guides there at the places, they all have degrees in marine biology, because they could make more guiding at Avalon or whatever than they could at, being a marine biologist. But they knew, the science and everything. And they were the ones that said, here's the problem. And they pinpointed the problem, the killing the fish, the netting and everything else. And so when they sort of figured that out and stopped it, then the bonefish in the Keys, I haven't seen bonefishing in Key West, anything. I don't even think back in the day it was as good as it's gotten, So you're seeing the bonefish really make a resurgence, and it's all because of the science and getting the data from BTT. They've done an unbelievable job.
Yeah, they really have. So Bob Rich, the guy who worked with you to get that dinner going, he is also the author of Looking Through Water. And on a previous podcast, he just said that he kind of called you in like a gunslinger to solve some technical problems. He was worried the fishing scenes in the movie might not work out well.
Well, that's it's funny because I hadn't talked to Bob in a year because of COVID. And so I'm literally pulling into, it's 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm pulling up to a tarpon area, and I can see fish ahead of me rolling. And so I'm telling my angler, grab your rod, start stripping out line. And I'm literally grabbing my push pole, and the phone rings. And I figure it's one of my buddies, Justin Ray, or Will Betts, or somebody calling to say, hey, where are you? Or, we compare, we're not stepping on each other, whatever. And it's Bob. And in those days, we used to call him Bubba. So I answered the phone and I said, Bubba, what are you doing? Where have you been? And he's like, Dex, and he goes, so they're making my book into a movie. And I'm like, Looking Through Water? And he's like, yeah. And it's like, wow, how cool is that? And it's like, yeah, it's like Michael Douglas. And I'm like, oh my God, this is cool. And he said, but they don't, they don't know much about fishing, and we got to teach some of these actors how to cast and stuff. Do you think you could help us out? And so I said, yeah, sure. He said, can I have the producers call you? And I said, sure. And I was heading back to New York, and one of the actors, Michael Stahl David, lived in New York, and they wanted me to start teaching him to cast. So by the time I get going and I'm up there and they're there, and Michael Stahl David is, he's having a baby, so the timing doesn't work. And so now the time is condensing, and the next thing we meet with the producers and the director and everything else, and Bob and I have a Zoom call with them. And we realized after that Zoom call, he calls me and he says, you know something? I said, Bob, they don't have a clue about fishing, and, Michael Stahl David, he's leaving day after tomorrow for Belize. And so Bob says, you got to come with me. We went down there, and what was supposed to be 1 week turned into 3 weeks. And it was a great learning experience, because you really find out how difficult a movie is to make, and especially one where you're shooting on water, And so, there was a lot of stuff that we had to get right, Bob. When we looked at the teams and how everything was set up, I'd just spent 3 years in Belize fishing a redbone tournament, that still exists, called Redbone at Large. And it was like, okay, well, we got to make this look realistically. So Bob and I bought down old tackle boxes, old fishing rods, old stretcher boxes, to make even the sets look, halfway decent. And then, getting the people to cast. Luckily, there was a girl I'd told them about down there that I'd known for years, Lori Ann Murphy. And so Lori Ann had Real Women down there years ago. She worked at El Pescador. So she was working with some of the people down there and getting the guides situated. So by the time that we got down there, David Morris had taken lessons in Pennsylvania somewhere around, so he was getting up to speed. The minute we got there, I got Michael Stahl David, who plays young William, to start casting, and so we just trying to get the thing to look right. But it's hard on water, because there's different color water. The barge that we're shooting from is huge, and it's got 40 cameras and people on it, so you're trying to get everything, just getting the actors to realize what a guide's relationship is with the angler. And eventually we had to, one of the funny things in the beginning is I said, well, maybe you need a casting double for David Morris or something. What happens then? They said, well, he's learning, but you'll never get a casting double because he's 6'5". I said, I got 2 guys. And so that's why we decided, okay, let's get a gang together that not only fishes, but can make the shotgun scene right, that have done this before and everything else. So we called Justin Ray and Steve Bouchard and Tim Borski's son, Joseph, because he's going to play, it's a father-son tournament. Uh-huh. And so we said, okay, all you guys come down, help us do this, because the shotgun start at the beginning of the tournament. These guys had fished the red bones for years, so everybody knew what it was like, and to give the action, and also if David Morris couldn't cast, Steve Bouchard and Justin Ray were both 6'5". So, but David Morris could cast, he'd actually spent a lot of time. The same thing with Michael Stahl David. I couldn't believe that in one day of spending with him, because they're actors and they got to get it right quick, they're quick studies. But he was forming loops, and, it was like, wow, okay, I think this is going to work,
So then you never had to use a casting double?
No. They, Michael Stahl David isn't supposed to be able to cast.
Yeah, he's a beginner.
New.
Yeah.
David Morris is the father, and David could, he could do it. Cameron Douglas, he's supposed to be the guide, so we're trying to instruct him how the guide and the anglers work together, that you got to point the fish 1 o'clock, this and that, strip the fly. You're sort of leading him. There's a couple of lines that David Morris used, because I spent so much time with him, like, now put your tip down, strip, bump, 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 where
bump, 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 yeah.
There's a certain point where he's talking to William, Michael Stahl David, and he says, it's like painting telephone wires. And I kept telling David, you got to keep the tip straight. It doesn't matter where it is. But just imagine you're painting telephone wires, Well, I never thought he'd use it in the movie, but when he's instructing him, I guess that came to his mind. He says, like painting telephone wires, So, it was really an experience, really a lot of fun. The people, the actors were great, but you see how hard it is. And as far as the fishing scenes, we had to source. I had, you can't, some of it had visual effects, some of it had to be sourced because it's not like you're going out and you're going to, in the time slotted, you're going to be hooking 100-pound tarpon and everything's good and the camera's perfect. So it doesn't work that way. So we had to source stuff to make it fit and how it all works together. So
Yeah. There was some of the dialogue and the action in the guiding scenes, like where you're saying where the guide was saying cast 1 o'clock, or when he was saying bump, 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 which is really like authentic guide lingo. But how does an actor or even a screenplay writer know that stuff? If they've never been out with a guide, they're not going to know that. So
that's what we spent a lot of time doing is having them understand the guide's relationship with the angler and what they're trying to do, and even, none of these guys had ever fished. The director, you'd have to sit down with the director because it's really the director's vision, So Roberto Snyder, Bob and I sat a lot of times having dinner with him at night, trying to explain. Even with the actors, we spent a lot of time, trying to get, this is what it is like. This is what you're trying to do. You spot the fish and this. And, all in all, it turned out really well. And the people, I think Michael Stahl-David's coming out right after the premiere, to go fishing and to visit Steve Bouchard. A lot of us
Really?
became really good friends,
do some striper fishing.
Yeah, so, and Cameron Douglas. Cameron and I talk all the time because he's, it was fun, and it was an experience that, it made me understand. And now I look at movies and think, okay, that's what they did there. They cut this, So the appreciation of and how hard it is to make a movie, and especially one like this. You've got a great story that Bob did. Looking Through Water's a generational. It's a family picture. It's just a great story. But to get it so that it feeds well for the fishing. The biggest critics were going to be the fly fishing. Our people.
Yeah. Well, and really, Looking Through Water's not a fly fishing film or a fishing film. It's a beautiful piece of art. It's about families and trauma and challenges. There just happens to be fly fishing in it. But I think if the fly fishing scenes are bad, for me, it could be a distraction, right? Because you start thinking about that instead of the bigger picture, which is the messaging of the movie and stuff like that. But I think you guys nailed it.
We hope so.
It's not distracting. You can focus on the story.
Yeah, and that's the thing is like any film, you're always going to be able to, and especially for us. I mean, I've watched many fly fishing films, and it's tough because you can critique and say, oh, that's not right. For John Q, he's not going to have any clue. That it's going to look great. It's all this. If you're looking to pick, we can always find it, especially in the day and age of CGI and how they make films and everything else. So it's pretty damn good. It was I'd seen a lot of, I mean, the river runs through it, I mean, it's a fabulous, but it's not a film about, it's fly fishing and the family, but it's really a family drama story, that is fly fishing as its basis, and this is very similar, it's a generational something that happens with this family, and it centers around fishing, and that's what makes it, a beautiful story for us anyway, because, it's all about the fishing. So
one of the critical parts of the film is this tournament that you were helping with, and it's a father-son tournament, and they need to catch, the team needs to catch a permit, a tarpon, and a bonefish. That's the idea. And when I was watching, I was like, man, a river runs through it or something. You can just keep a fake trout in a cage, and you can pull it out and use it whenever you need it. But like to have bonefish, tarpon, and permit, like that is challenging. And just in my mind, I'm like, it's probably easier to like create the Death Star. Because, if you do a Star Wars movie, people are letting go of reality, but you're trying to present reality to fishermen. That's a difficult challenge.
And that was the thing that, and in this, you had to, I sat with the editor and the director hours, trying to go frame by frame, because they're not stripping right. They're, the tip is in this, or the backing's that, or the, all these things. And you realize how hard it really is, to try to, make it, right, and that was the thing. And especially with Bob and myself, we wanted to have something that, that was really authentic, that it wasn't, and it's not like you're going to go out and, like I say, catch, oh, look at, we got a bunch of bonefish, or we got, you can't do it that way. There's scenes where we got stuff. There's scenes that you have to, work with visual effects. There's no way around it. So, but all in all, I think it turned out really good. And it's true to the book, and it's and there's a lot of fun stuff, and it's a great love story. There's it's a tearjerker. It's all the things that you like for a great movie. So.
Speaking of being authentic, one of my favorite parts was not even had to do with the tournament. It's the love interest. And you and I and everyone, thousands of other people have seen Lefty teach people at the casting pond. And, there's a woman, he comes in behind, holds her hand, shows her how to cast. We've all seen this 1,000 times. I love how the movie turns it around. And she comes up behind young William McKay, holds his hand, and they have the female teaching him how to cast.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, it's perfect. And she's actually known in the fly fishing world as being a world-class angler. That's sort of the story.
Is she really?
Yeah, I mean, she's the one that really has the creds, in the film itself, that she's the, she just happens to be there, but she's already well known within that tournament and everything as a great angler. So it's it's great. Sort of one of the funny things was, so one of the deals was is we were going to bring all these people down and everything, and so and we've got some great anglers. Justin Ray, Steve Bouchard, Jason from IGFA. I mean, and Joseph Borski. So the deal was, okay, we're going to go out, we're going to film this, give us one day. And it was hot as Hades. It must have been 110 degrees. There's storms. Everybody's dripping. And we're in this confined area, all sitting in the boats to do the Shotgun Star. But the deal is that come down and do this, and then we'll spring for 2 days of guided fishing, So, we're all like, okay, that's over. Let's go fishing. So we go out, and you've got some great anglers. Justin's probably one of the best permit guys in the world. Steve Bouchard's an unbelievable caster, and so we all go out, and so pretty much all of us got skunked except for Joseph Borski. So Joseph's, Tim Borski's young son. So Joseph goes out, and the guide says, "Excuse me, I got to go to the bathroom." So he said, "Why don't you just get out and wade?" So all of us get skunked. Joseph Borski gets out and starts wading. He catches 19 bonefish and 3 permit. The rest of us get skunked.
Whoa.
And I was like,
that's a run.
But that was, it was perfect, that the kid, does the best,
Son of the snake hunter.
Yes, yeah.
I like Tim's herpetology stuff and the snaking
great.
he does.
And
it's
Joseph's
awesome.
just as good.
Really?
Yeah,
I love that stuff.
So I used to go snake hunting with my son, with Joseph, and with Tim years ago in the Everglades. I've known Tim the same thing. That's why we did the tournaments. Bob, Tim, and I were all really good buddies down in the Keys, and then it was the snake hunting and the moth hunting, and it's cool.
Very cool. One last question. I heard that you were in the movie, and I was looking for you in the movie, looking through water. I didn't see it. What scene are you in? I got to go rewatch.
Oh, man, I don't even want to,
I thought maybe the bar fight. I actually replayed the bar fight to see if I could see you.
Yeah, I'm sitting back there knocked on the ground. No, it's funny because, talking about Flip, so I started looking because the film takes place back in the 80s, so it's back a ways. And so I'm thinking, okay, I remember what we used to wear. But I'm going through like, okay, what's the 80s look, And I come across this picture. It's pretty well known now, and it's Flip polling. And he's got this pork pie hat, cut off jeans, and, he's polling. And I thought, I need to find a hat like that. So weirdly enough, I go out the next weekend and I'm across over in the North Fork of Long Island or something. I go in this shop and there's this hat, it's like, that's perfect, because we're trying to match the era that we're taking all the stuff down with us, So I get the hat, I come back, I stick some flies in it. We find this old shirt, roll up the pants, whatever. And so now it's like and I didn't even know what the deal was, but they asked me, they said, oh, you got to be in the thing. But I was bringing this for, not so much myself, but, if somebody needed a hat, and they're going to, and they're telling you, we don't know what's going to happen. You may be in it, we may put it. So anyway, so it was just a prop that I brought along. So anyway, so it ends up that, oh, you got to have a little part here. That's why Bob started calling me Alfred, because Alfred Hitchcock, always had a little part. So anyway, I'm in the scene where they're signing up for the tournament,
Oh, okay.
And,
close to the beginning.
And when I see the outfit, it's like, oh my God, please no. So anyway, it was fun, but it's I'd like to forget.
You're not going to wear that outfit to the premiere next week?
I don't think so.
The New York City premiere? No.
But that was the fun thing about it, is that everybody had so much fun. And hanging with Bob for that was 3 weeks, lots of laughs, and that's the one thing that we've always had together. It was all about the humor and the fun, and this was like the accumulation of a lifetime of great fun together. So
he's a great guy, and the book, and he really captured the spirit of fly fishing, I think.
Yeah, he did a great job. And I used to sit with Bob. We'd go fishing, Sandy Moret, myself, and Bob. And Bob was constantly, I'd say, Bob, do you want to get up and take a shot? No, I'm writing. I'd say, what are you writing? And he'd talk about the book that he was writing. Well, I got this. I'm writing this thing on and it was, he's got 6 books. So, I remember once with the Delphi Cafe, the Secret, it was just, and that's what I always loved about Bob. He was always, thinking of, his next book or what he was writing about. He was just passionate about fishing, and he was so much fun. That was really what, and it's still that fun continues on to this day. It's always a laugh with Bob.
And we'll continue on this week with the premiere, and then the film's going to come out September 12th.
It's opening at, I don't know how many hundreds of theaters, which is great, because going back to the theaters is I think a lot of people are appreciating going back to the theater. I know I am, It's like that was always great fun, having some popcorn, your tongue, going, taking, your date, the wife, whatever, and going to the theaters. It's great.
You might meet your future wife at a movie. You don't know.
She's not anymore. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, thank you very much for coming in. That was awesome. Looking forward to
thanks
the
for
movie.
having me, Ross. It was really a pleasure. Just happy to be here. I've read your magazine since my beginning. Fly fishing was always one of my favorites. Every issue. And, it was always something I could learn from the greats and, great places to go. So you've been a part of my life as much as, half the people in it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot coming from you.
It was great. Thanks so much.